All right. Welcome to the Evolutionary Basics II, some more key conceptual tools for your adventure in evolutionary psychology. I'm very excited to have you along for this momentous ride. Okay, so just your overview slide here. We're going to talk through some more game theory, hence my wonderful graphic here. And this is all stuff that will kind of get you ready for some things that we're going to cover in the course. Okay, so just reviewing the evolutionary basics, number one, the core engine of evolution can be conceptualized as these three things: the variability, inheritance, and selection. And if those three things are working, then you know you're going to have evolution. So just to review our example with the peppered moths, back in the day, before the Industrial Revolution, the white-colored moth was more popular, but there was still variability, that's the blue cog, in that there were still some black moths around too. But they had this trait that was inherited and passed down, but then what happened is the selection pressure changed because the Industrial Revolution came along and the coal made the trees black. So then the black moths were harder for the birds to see. So the selection pressure changed such that there was more selective pressure against the white moths, and then the frequency of the gene in the population changed such that more black moths were present, and there was a higher percentage of them in the population. So that's the mechanics of basic engine of evolution. And if you haven't done the moth simulation yet, I highly encourage that. You get to be a bird eating moths. How else would you like to spend your time? Okay, so another point is some trade-offs are common. We talked about the female pelvis as being a trade-off between keeping the baby in when the parent or the mother is walking upright and making the pelvis wide enough so that the baby can be born easily. So, and it's not a perfect solution because you're trying to do two things with the same structure. And then we also talked about how males and females have different trade-offs when they face, when they're having friendships. Males benefit a little bit more from having a wider range of friendly relationships because those are all potential coalition partners. Females face a little bit more competitive pressure from friends who are after the same things as they are. So the way they have friends and the way friendship processes work for the two is a little bit different. We talked about reproductive fitness as the basic currency of evolution. Anything that increases the overall survival of the offspring in the long term contributes to reproductive fitness and makes it more likely that that trait will get passed on. And then we also talked about how evolutionary psychology rejects the standard social science model in which it tends to follow a trajectory where it conceptualizes human nature as a blank slate, which is infinitely malleable and can be changed by culture. Evolutionists believe it's a little more stubborn than that, in that we were pre-wired to behave in certain ways. So two quick examples. One, you can think about male aggression as being something that just is taught to you by your culture. So we might look at American culture and say, you know, it's because men play football and we have violent action movies. That's why men are taught to be violent in our culture. But if you look across cultures, it's pretty consistent that men are more likely to use aggression in different kinds of situations. Of course, that doesn't make it right, but we're just trying to understand it. But there's a reason to think that male aggression evolved as a strategy in the evolutionary environment, and so that's why we see it still today. And then in social psychology, they'll talk about social identity theory, and this is this idea that people get their identity from certain groups that they're a part of. And it's postulated that it's very arbitrary what group you see yourself as a part of. So you could think about yourself as belonging to a certain race, black or white or brown or whatever, or a certain class, like working class or wealthy or middle class or any of that. But evolutionary psychology comes along and says it's likely that it's not an arbitrary process, that part of what drives how we define ourselves is there's certain things that are more likely to be taken as markers for kinship, and that would be people that we share genes with. So whereas with the social identity theory, it predicts that either race or class could be the organizing principle of identity. It's much more likely, given the kinship perspective, that race would be taken as a marker for identity rather than class. And the phenomenon of Trump appealing to working class white voters is a case in point. It's historically in America, it's been much harder to form unions and things that operate across class lines, and it's been increasingly likely that you see coalitions organized around racial identities. So that's still up for debate, and that's still a testable issue, but I'm just saying that's an example of how evolutionary psychology would point in a different direction. Okay, so let's dig into some of the new stuff. The selfish gene, or what it might call the gene-centric view, is a really helpful heuristic for trying to understand why certain traits and features come about. So The Selfish Gene was this famous book that was published by Richard Dawkins, this biologist that has written a number of books popularizing different kinds of environmental concepts. I don't know if popularizing is the right term, but he's widely read. So you can read it as a layperson. You don't need to be a biologist. And he's arguing that we really need to understand the way evolution works in terms of a gene-centered view. So the costs and benefits, in other words, of different kinds of traits, they cash out at the gene level. And it's the way you think about it is the gene lineage is trying to maximize its reproductive fitness. And it's almost a coincidence that we have bodies that the gene organizes, because the bodies are really, from the gene's perspective, just a way of replicating the gene. So one of the implications of this is he rejects group level selection. So he doesn't try to understand altruism in terms of improving outcomes for the group. He thinks that's misguided, and he thinks that anytime you have altruism, it should be explicable or explainable in terms of how it benefits the individual's genes at the individual level. So I have a little skull and crossbones here because he doesn't believe in group selection. Okay, so some more examples of this. One thing thinking about males and coalitional behavior is these high-risk strategies that males sometimes adopts can pay out at the gene level, even if it looks like it's causing different kinds of senseless deaths for those males that engage in that risky or aggressive behavior. So the male warrior genotype can pay off for the gene, even if it doesn't pay off for the individual person. So when you hear males claiming that the only thing they care about is the group welfare, and that they are advocating, attacking, or defending the group because it's going to be better for the group, as my son would say, those claims are a little bit sus, in terms of suspicious, that we'd want to interrogate those and see if maybe they're looking to increase their own reproductive fitness at the expense of the group, and that their claims about being only interested in the group might not wholly bear out. Okay, and so another implication of this is that genes should favor kin cooperation. In other words, because we have shared genetic material with our genetic relatives, we benefit the genes benefit if we can promote their survival. So in other words, we can see genes being selected for acting altruistically towards kin because of this phenomenon of inclusive fitness. We'll talk more about that later, but it comes out of this gene-centric view. Okay, so to dig a little deeper in this idea of explaining senseless deaths. So I'm thinking about two males getting in an argument over something. One of them got dissed by the other one, and somebody ends up getting stabbed or shot. And we look at them and go, how stupid to have a fight over some little piece of trivia and somebody ends up dead. Well, it's not that it's not stupid, but it might make more sense if we view it from the genes perspective. So I'm suggesting here, like when you see two large elk battling for who gets to mate with the females, something similar might be going on with that reckless young male behavior. So just a thought experience. experiment. Imagine like you have 10 men with a gene for aggressive risk-taking, and 9 of those die when they're young, competing for females, for status, for wealth. Lots of times some of these skirmishes are about status. Somebody feels like they've been disrespected. So if you have those 10 and 9 die young, but 1 has many successful mating opportunities and then dies in mid-age, but the women that he had mating relationships with bear his children and raise them to adulthood, could that aggressiveness gene survive? And then what if, thinking about this, what if the non-aggressive gene tends to produce 0 offspring? So maybe it's the case that if you're not aggressive at all, people take your stuff with no consequence, and then it's hard for you to attract mates. So anyway, the takeaway is that aggression may not pay out for the individual person. The individual person may die, but aggression might pay out for the gene if it pays out handsomely once in a while for some individuals who have that gene. Okay, so game theory number 2. We did a little bit of game theory in the last one of these. We're going to do some more here. So the essence of game theory is that you're modeling different agents that are seeking maximum gain. So in other words, the key here is that you're thinking about different agents interacting. Well, we can take it to a slightly different level if you imagine you have different types of agents. And where I'm going with this is if you imagine males and females as playing slightly different games when it comes to reproductive fitness, how males and females interact gets even more complicated, because you can have coalitional behavior on the part of males, you can have coalitions on the part of females, and it gets really complex. So some other complex dynamics that we're going to talk about in this lecture: number 1, inclusive fitness; 2, coalitional dynamics; and 3, parental investment. So just a quick sketch of each of those. So inclusive fitness has to do with the dynamics that arise when you have shared genes, and it can fuel some cooperation because that cooperation is promoting those shared genes. And it suggests also that if you have different genes, you're going to be more likely to want to compete. Coalitional dynamics emerge when you have individuals working together for some kind of collective good, and it raises the issue about who allies with whom, and who can you trust, and to what extent do you want to align yourself with a winner, even if they might have some other drawbacks in terms of maybe they aren't as ethical. And then the third element here where we can see some complex game theory is in this parental investment. And that's the essence of the question, how much should I invest in Junior? Junior being my stand-in for some of your, for some kind of offspring. So it turns out for most mammals, females are going to invest a lot in offspring, and males are like, well, let me think about that. And lots of males end up investing heavily in their offspring, but that's not always the case. And there's a difference between males and females in terms of the game that they're playing. Okay, so a little more here on game theory. Game theory predicts some complex strategies are going to emerge. For example, males might mix strategies. So here I just have a little snippet from Trivers, who was one of the first guys to write about this parental investment stuff. So he says, in species where there's been a strong selective pressure for male parental care, in other words, the care of males makes a difference in the survivability of the offspring, it could be that the males adopt a mixed strategy as the optimal male course. So that is, they'll form some kind of pair bond with one young fertile female and take care of her and her offspring, but they're not going to pass up opportunities to sow their seeds, so to speak. So he's not saying yet every species, every male is going to adopt that strategy, but it would logically make sense given the game that males are playing. So in other words, to simplify this, somebody might simply play the field, have a lot of relationships with a lot of females, and make low investments. Or somebody might invest with one woman, but also play the field as opportunities arise. In other words, have affairs on the side, or extra pair copulations, as they're called. Now, Trivius doesn't say this, but I'm going to throw out here, it also might be the case that some males compete by choosing, and maybe not, this is something that they don't rationally choose, but they're built in such a way where they adopt this strategy, but they might have a true fidelity strategy. So in other words, they're just wired, and they're playing out this option in the game where they're truly faithful to a partner, and that makes them particularly attractive, so they might be better able to attract a really high quality female. So all I'm suggesting is game theory suggests that once you have multiple agents and they're interacting with each other, you can get multiple permutations of what would be an effective strategy, and it really gets complex because what you do depends upon what others do and vice versa. Okay, one more just general kind of concept here of game theory is that you should expect some coevolution, some arms race kind of stuff, where if you have, say, like a predator or like a bird and different kinds of insects, you should expect that as the predator gets better at eating insects, those insects are under selective pressure to develop better disguises, and you can get this feedback loop where innovations on one side of the equation cause innovations on the other side. So there's insects that are designed by natural selection to look like leaves. So here you have another one. This guy right here, you can make out, is an actual insect, but he looks an awful lot like a leaf. So he's got some pretty good protection from getting eaten by a bird. And then this guy, it just strikes me as completely wild, but you can see he has a leaf-like tail that's made to mimic the kind of leaves that he might find himself mixed in among. So again, game theory suggests that you're going to get arms races where both sides are in essence look like they're trying to outcompete the other side. But in reality, right, that all this stuff is not at the conscious level. It's just the way evolution is spinning out different kinds of consequences. Okay, and then I'm making a joke here, but to really master game theory, you need to play Rampage, which is a game my son and I have played, where you are a dinosaur, or actually no, I think you're like a Godzilla-like creature, and you're competing against other Godzilla-like creatures by throwing school buses and other things at buildings so that you can eat the meeples. The meeples are a lot like peoples, but they're a little smaller and more wooden. Anyway, Rampage, fun game. Okay, inclusive fitness. So this is an idea that came about from William Hamilton, famous biologist, and he was trying to explain altruism towards kin. And so he has this great simplified equation where what he's saying is how related you are to somebody. So like you're more related to a sibling, say, than a second cousin. And the amount of benefits that you get by helping that cousin, how many offspring they can produce. If that relationship is really strong and there's a lot of benefits and the cost is pretty small to the altruist, then nature's going to select for that kind of altruism, that kind of kin helping. So what it's suggesting is there's an evolutionarily stable strategy of helping that comes about if it enables you to pass on more copies of your gene by helping those people that share your genes. So the implications of this is it's one way we can think about why people might help other people in a way that seems like evolution, which driven by a selfish gene, wouldn't bring about. So you'll note, though, with humans, kinship identification is tricky. We don't have a serial number where we can check and see if somebody is our kin or not. So there's all these kinship markers that we use instead, where if we believe we have a common ancestor, or if somebody has similar beliefs to us, same religion, same phenotype, in other words, they look like they're the same people as us, the same kind of race, if we share a language, if we have similar rituals, proximity, familiarity, all these things are markers. In other words, things that lead us to think that other person might be kin. And the implication of this then is that we're going to have a bias towards people that we think are our kin. And social psychologists talk about this phenomenon more broadly as an in-group bias, but it's likely grounded in this kinship marker identification. Okay, so it predicts another implication where women are going to look for help. So who shares the most genetic material with what the woman is interested in? Well, the father of the children is going to share a lot of, is going to be motivated to help the woman because they both are invested in, from a genes perspective, in the offspring. And then you would expect the grandmother, the mother's mother, to also be very invested in helping her daughter raise offspring because that's her genetic lineage. So the amount of genetic overlap is a good place to start for figuring out where women look for help in raising offspring. And this theory also predicts that you're going to get coalitions that form along kinship lines. So in other words, it shouldn't surprise us that you have tribes competing with other tribes or certain nations competing with other nations because they see themselves as part of the same kinship group. Similarly, morality can be inflected by this. So coalitional morality has a different standard for us versus them. And then a less coalizing morality, more universalizing, where you have a view of universal human rights. So in other words, coalitions can suck in morality in terms of whether or not we give full moral recognition to other beings based on whether or not they're in our coalition or not. Okay, and then the big daddy that's important, especially for understanding male and female differences, is parental investment theory. So Robert Trivers in 1972 wrote about this. Parental investment is a contribution that increases the fitness of the offspring. And so you can think about feeding or sheltering, protecting, educating, all that stuff would make it more likely that the offspring is going to survive and pass on your genes. So there's obviously an inclusive fitness logic here that by promoting your offspring, you're actually promoting your own genes. But it also suggests that there's this opportunity cost. So an opportunity cost is just if I spend my money on watching movie A, I don't have the same money to spend on watching movie B. So it forces organisms to make trade-offs. So parental investment precludes, for example, mate-seeking investment. So in other words, just to oversimplify, if you think about a male sitting at home, okay, do I stay home here and help raise Junior, or do I go out and play the field? The other way of thinking about it is, do I invest in Junior or do I invest in myself? So you can imagine, the stereotype of the guy working late at the office. He can say he's doing it for his family, but if he's advancing his career, he's making himself more attractive to other potential mates in the future. So there's a way in which men might be drawn to that for reasons we'll talk about in a second. And then the other thing is, do you form coalitions to get more resources? So these are all opportunities that males in particular have, where they don't necessarily have to make the same levels of investment that females do. Trivers, the way he talked about it, is females have a higher obligatory investment to make in offspring. Because if the mothers don't commit, it's very unlikely that the child can live. But men can adopt this different strategy where they have a relationship, some mating opportunity with a female. They're invested for a good 5 or 10 minutes. And then the female is left with a choice of whether to, if she gets pregnant, bring that child to term and raise that child. So men and women are playing, in essence, different reproductive games, if we're thinking about this in terms of game theory. Okay, so fleshing out this a bit more. Okay, so the one way of thinking about it is males face higher opportunity costs for parental investment. So because they can seek out other mates who would bear or raise their offspring. Okay, so males can pay higher opportunities costs because they can go and make more offspring with somebody else and let that somebody else raise their child. So just to use a meme here, they can either invest in the current children or they can make more children. So the classic disloyal or boyfriend that's having trouble staying home is attracted by a different woman. That's this initial dilemma that I'm talking about. So females face a lower opportunity cost because they can only be pregnant with one child for 9 months. And then even after that, they're not really in a good position to have another child for a few years until that one child has been weaned and is no longer breastfeeding. So females are much more inclined, their way they're built, they are kind of designed to optimize the fitness of one child at a time. So males, in essence, know that shirking works, that the females will raise the child. So it creates this dilemma where males can do something else besides be a devoted father. And once you think about it from a game theory perspective, certain males, like Genghis Khan, can form these coalitions and go out and spread their seed widely. So in other words, you know, it's kind of dark, but in terms of the rape and pillage model of warfare, you can have, if you're conquering other peoples, you can have lots of relationships with lots of females. Now, again, this is not saying that that's necessarily what all males would do. Another male might find a female that they're very attracted to and is high quality, and they say, you know what, I'm in. I'm going to invest heavily in these children, and I'm not going to have relationships with anybody else. But the point is, from an evolutionary perspective, males are facing higher opportunity costs for that kind of choice. Okay, so I think this is the last major concept. We have and we're going to talk more about this later in the course, but we're going to critique the weird worldview. So weird is this acronym that this guy, Joseph Henrich, and some of his students came up with, where they're thinking that the Western world, so to speak, basically Europe and its colonies like America, Australia, etc., and to some extent the Japan and Taiwan and countries like that. But when you're weird, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic, you behave very differently and you're psychologically distinct. So he becomes this critic of provincial psychology based on his perspective as an anthropologist and someone who works with cultural evolution. And I'll talk about why I'm mentioning this here in a second, but his basic model, which is in this new book, The Weirdest People in the World, is that European history is a story of kinship networks being dismantled. It's kind of a quirky story, but basically the Catholic Church in many ways undermined kinship networks by preventing cousin marriage and other kinds of close kin marriages. And in essence, it promoted instead these voluntary associations. And Henrich is arguing with lots of great data that really is the birthplace of modern individualism, where we tend to think of ourselves as individual first and like members of any kind of tribe second. So the implication here is that we tend to underestimate the importance of kinship as an organizing principle in the world just because it's not as central to our identity. And the reason kinship is so powerful is because it has a lot of inclusive fitness potential. So, and it's reasonable to assume in the ancestral environment that these different kin networks were really sources of loyalty and that the kin networks competed with each other. So one implication of this is we can understand history is the story of different kin networks competing with each other. So there's this old Bedouin saying, it's oftentimes attributed to like an Afghanistan saying, but it says, I against my brothers, I and my brothers against my cousins, and I and my brothers and my cousins against the world. So it's saying at different levels, the inclusive fitness logic works differently. You're going to compete with your kin because your genes are more unique to you than they are to your kin. But if it comes to a larger conflict, you're going to align with your kin because you have more in common with them than you do against distant kin or unrelated people. So the again, you have some game theory logic playing out here, where the inclusive fitness logic predicts you're going to get coalitional violence, where this kinship network is going to try to extract resources from this other kinship network. And you have a traditional morality that's pretty organized around the group. So helping your family is great, or helping other people that are Jewish, or helping other people that are Protestants, or whatever it is recognized as a good thing, but you're assumed to be against those people that are outside your group, or they don't get the same moral protections. So you can understand a lot of what happened in the 2021 Capitol riots as certain people understanding that their group had been disenfranchised, and they are upset. So there's a way in which that coalition, or different coalitions that stormed the Capitol, really were seeing themselves as a certain kind of group. And oftentimes people would point out the fact that it's largely white people. So there was this probably some kinship dynamics going on there. Okay, and then implication number 2, I point out, is that individualism can really limit our view. And what I mean by that is we tend to think as individuals, and we tend to theorize as individuals. So there's a way in which people will distrust evolutionary explanations, say especially about sexuality, because it feels kind of restrictive. It feels like it's not letting people make their own choices. It feels like things are predestined. So we tend to view sexuality as this authentic and unique self-expression role, and we want to value that, and we want to recognize people for how they understand their own sexuality. And we also, given this Western tendency, we really valorize norm-breaking and nonconformity. And there's a way in which evolutionary explanations can feel kind of oppressive. So just possibility, and this is a sensitive topic, so I'm just throwing out some ideas, but it might possibly be that some of this ways of thinking force us to deny some broad typical patterns. So the idea that, statistically speaking, males tend to be a lot stronger than females, and females tend to be more emotional. We might then avoid explaining typical patterns, like why are males aggressive. We might want to attribute it to culture, because then it feels like it's more flexible and it's something that we can alter. But that might not really be what the data are leading us to. And it could be in our effort to avoid stereotyping that we don't talk about commonalities. We don't talk about ways in which, women tend to be like this and men tend to be like this, and why is that? So in all of this, I want to suggest very quickly that whereas that individualism can limit our ability to think in this more evolutionary way, potentially, it doesn't in any way suggest that we need to think about cis sexuality or heterosexualism as being more appropriate. So to put that in fancy terms, there's no need for heteronormativity, where we say that these more typical patterns, in other words, straight or whatever you want to call it, are somehow better. Typical does not mean better or preferred. So I'm thinking about a famous basketball coach that's female. Pat Summitt was a legend and was very good at what she did. And you think about female-female couples or male-male couples, and these are all things that we can endorse and we can value and we can recognize diversity, but that doesn't mean that we can't, do some homework and study on some of these more typical patterns that might be inflected by certain evolutionary strategies. And my suspicion is that years from now, when we look at these other ways in which sexuality gets expressed, that there are biological reasons for a lot of that. And that's not to say it's right or wrong or anything like that, but all human behavior at some level is biological and has roots in biology, and that's kind of the shtick that evolution is speaking. And I just want to make sure that give you a way to see that that's not in any way prescriptive or limiting the valuing of human diversity. All right, I think that is, let's just check here. I think that is it. Yep, that's the end. Okay, so thank you for listening to some more of that theoretical stuff that'll get you set up for more ideas in the course. And I hope you enjoyed. Okay, thank you.